Good. All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Emancipations podcast for a very exciting interview with a good friend of the show, Tony Chamas, who is making his second appearance on Emancipations. The first time we talked about his widely seen and discussed and debated video on the Cultural Revolution in China. But today we want to invite Tony to talk about liberalism. So this is a philosophy podcast, so we usually talk about concepts. We talk about books, authors, debates in Marxist studies. We focus a lot on critical theory, the legacy of French theory, and much more. I'm excited about this conversation, comrades, for a couple reasons. One is Tony and I have a lot of differences of outlook regarding the left, regarding the question of how to rejuvenate socialism in our time. But these are comradely points of tension and disagreement that don't elevate to something much more catastrophic. We're always doing voice notes. And I come to understand, Tony, that many people hate voice notes, like, sending on WhatsApp, or I guess you do it even on your phone as well. But you're a fan of voice notes.
I hope you are too. I assumed you are because you respond with them.
I'm a big fan. I
Okay,
get a lot of
I don't want to get arthritis. That's why. I hate typing.
I know. Yeah. I know, right? Well, I even do the voice to text. So when I text. But anyways, welcome back to Emancipations. How are you this evening?
I'm pretty good, and it's nice to be here again. A lot has changed since the last time I was here. You've come on, I think, maybe 2-3 times on One Dime Radio since.
Yeah. So formal introduction. Tony is a student of and a master. You also have your PhD?
I have a master's.
Okay. Well, you sometimes exude PhD-ness, to me at least.
I appreciate it.
And
maybe I'll submit my book as a PhD.
Yeah, you have a forthcoming book on the meaning of democracy, the crisis of democracy, which you can tell us a little bit about that in a moment. But Tony is kind of like a new intellectual for our time, who's using YouTube, using podcasts to actually produce extremely thoughtful and entertaining content and videos. Most recently, and we can touch upon this a little bit, is a very extensive historical, philosophical overview of all the predominant sects and tendencies within Marxism. So Tony has, and I've seen this video, it's on his he has 2 YouTube channels. One is One Dime Radio and one is just called One Dime, where more conceptual videos are produced. These are kind of short documentaries. They're usually scripted and thought out with a lot of attention and care and detail. So I admire that work quite a lot. And of course, he has a Patreon where he's always giving all kinds of interesting things and interviewing interesting people. So let us start.
My podcast is on it.
The podcast is part of the Patreon as well. Yes. Mm-hmm. So let's start with the main topic for our discussion, which is the often complicated historical, but also not only historical, but like conceptual problematic of liberalism, defining both its main tendencies as a sort of political ideology, also as a political theory. One of the authors that both Tony and I are very influenced by is a figure by the name of Jean-Claude Michéa. He's a living French philosopher who, in my interview with Michael Barrett, kind of came up. His name came up. He's an autodidactic philosopher. He's an anti-liberal. He is a very fascinating socialist thinker. And one of the articles that Tony and I read for this discussion is by Michéa. It's called "The Unity of Liberalism." And in this piece, he tries to make an argument that we sort of have misunderstood liberalism in its historical trajectory. And he thinks that there's a profound unity between its cultural and its economic basis. and that liberalism actually subsumes, or sort of, you cannot distinguish liberalism from things like, say, republicanism. And so Michéa has this view of liberalism, which is almost like, oh my gosh, this is like this total ideological system built off of, fundamentally built off of, a hostility to the working class. And it's a bit confusing about how he periodizes the working class, because he also says that liberalism has its true ideological origins in the religious wars in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. And therefore, liberalism emerges as an ideology that is primarily built on pacification of social struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes important because once you get to the industrial period, Industrial Revolution, early 1800s, post-French Revolutionary period, there's an interesting thing happens, which is that the proletariat and socialism almost become that which liberalism now must pacify, but in the same modality, in form, as to its origins, which was pacifying religious conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about your view of liberalism, Michéa's, how you think about Michéa's presentation here, what you might add to my description, so we can kind of throw everything onto the table at first, and then we'll dig into it.
Well, maybe first add to what you said. A lot of all of these themes are in Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, and I actually think this pacification of conflict. Fukuyama, in many ways, accepts that liberalism, in many ways, liberal democracy and capitalism, are the pacification of megalothymia, the megalothymaic urges of humans. Except that Fukuyama thinks that's good, and that you want to keep that. With Michéa, I would describe, well, he's often described as the French Christopher Lasch. I wouldn't say I'm influenced by him because it was only very recently that I got into him. I'm very influenced by Christopher Lasch. And as soon as I heard of Michéa, because I was really looking for thinkers similar to Lasch, I feel like Lasch is one of the few thinkers that I feel like is very close to how I view the world politically and socially. And Michéa was often described as the French Christopher Lasch. He's often described as a conservative socialist, conservative communist. And it was thanks to you through the English translation of Michéa's work by Michael that I was able to access that and read this Unity of Liberalism essay on that Unity of Liberalism. So this could be a good way to answer your question quickly with how do I see liberalism? Well, that article doesn't really talk about republicanism that much. It's more about I would basically just sum up his thesis in the Unity of Liberalism. It's basically like we're used to thinking of conservatives and liberals as two opposing political forces. And it's often the tendency of people on the left to reject economic liberalism, but to embrace social liberalism or to embrace political liberalism. He says no, they are part of the same thing, and that the social liberalism is in some ways a superstructure for capitalism, and the economic liberalism is, a rationale also for the economic policies. The right just is more on the economic end, and the left is more on the social end. I mean, in many ways, I think Piketty captures this great with his dichotomy of the Brahmin left and merchant right. I think that's very spot on, because you have what is the left? It's the people who are ultimately pacifying white guilt, or I would just say PMC guilt, people who are more well off and want to kind of get their guilt out. And the right is kind of, it doubles down on, some of the more raw sentiments of people which is like, fuck me, fuck you guys. Let me just get my money. I don't care about immigrants. I don't care about this or that.
It's like transgressive, right? The
Yeah.
right has become this like playground of transgression, which is what the left used to be. Anyways, go on.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do I see liberalism? So, we had a debate, a friendly discussion on actually, I think it was a Patreon episode about liberalism. And I was trying to say where I still defend liberalism is not so much in the political philosophy of liberalism, because I would say I'm actually very opposed in some ways to the, or just at least very critical of the political philosophy of liberalism. But where I still defend it are things that we often associate with liberal governance, like constitutional rights, like representative democracy or representative government, because it was just called representative government before the word democracy was attached to it. There's a lot of those things I think are good, and I became more supportive of those things the more I learned about the disasters of actually existing socialism and what kind of seemed to be a common thread of problems in the way socialism was attempted. And also, I've never been quite convinced of, I would say, more on the ultra-left radical democracy end. People who believe in the workers' councils, being council democracy. I've been kind of more skeptical of that's practicability or applicability, as well as anarchist direct democracy. Been not as convinced on that. But these things all predate liberalism. Representative government, constitutional rights, civil liberties, checks on power, separation of powers. These all predate the word liberalism. Like the people like Montesquieu, right, or Machiavelli, who are often early pioneers of this sort of thing, they didn't call themselves liberals. It just wasn't around as a term. I mean, the word liberalism doesn't even get invented, I believe, until the 1800s, with parts of the, you could say, centrist liberal reformers who are actually opposed to the emerging socialist movement when the social questions emerging. That's why even Marx, you don't really see the word liberalism used in Marx very much at all, because the word wasn't quite popular yet. So what is liberalism? I mean, you'll probably be good at explaining this, but basically, maybe before giving a overly in-depth definition, I'll give a short definition of liberalism, which is liberalism is basically a political philosophy that takes value relativism as its pretty much guiding assumption. And it has a connection, and also it has a conception of society in which free individuals form a society, as opposed to society, an organic conception of society, where you start off with collectives and the collective is necessary for the individual. It's a very individualist philosophy, and it has ultimately an indifference to, you could say, the good, objective truth. There's a practical reason for that, because its emergence is, as you alluded to, tied up to wanting to kind of figure out with ways of containing social conflict, like religious war, namely. So there's a lot of that's baked into America, because America was where the Puritans could live without persecution and all kind of religions. So there's that. But the thing with liberalism is many early actually people associated with liberalism were even pointed out, like Tocqueville. There's a tension in which liberalism, because it doesn't have a clear definition of the good, it has a more relativistic view. It lends itself unable to deal with some of the most important philosophical civilizational questions. And that's where I think this article is really fascinating at getting at. And Michéa thinks the left has uncritically accepted a liberal worldview.
Yeah, and that's very good. So I heard what you said about state socialism. We'll get back to that little jab. I'm sure some of my listeners, bless them, were thinking, why is Tutt bringing somebody on that is critical of state socialism? But we are comrades here, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Of course, I have my criticisms of state socialism, but I don't think that they rise to the level of your criticisms. So Michéa says that liberalism produces what he calls a unitary subject, which is a subject devoid of qualities, and for whom there's a kind of very interesting idea of a kind of interior, the interiority of our subjectivity in liberalism is based on that kind of relativism. That's an important concept, but it's also based on a very particular relationship to social antagonisms. So I think you're very wise to say that liberalism becomes very politically problematic once capitalism enters into its industrial phase, precisely because it has to then become a disciplinary political philosophy or ideology over the possible inclusion of what Michéa calls virtues from below, which I really like that concept of virtues from below. But I want your thoughts on it. It does strike one similar to, say, Alistair MacIntyre or Christopher Lasch. The other question that people may be wondering is, why does Michéa use this word conservative socialism? It's not a comfortable framework, and I told Barrett that I don't like it at all. We can talk about this in a
I do,
moment.
but it's okay.
So we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Don't worry. But the question here is, first, an interesting proposal that he says, right? Which is, and I kind of really resonate with this. He says, in its historical arc, liberalism has created a system that is incapable and resistant to the integration of the common peoples values, and this creates the source of a conflict which effectively liberalism refuses to address. And what's very interesting about that is that it shows that the left, which, as you mentioned, is sort of embracing liberalism on the cultural and social level, what Michéa brings out is that the conflicts that are generated at the cultural social level are class-based, and that liberalism cannot integrate demands from the common, or let's call the working class in a Marxist sense, and that this stumbling block is the source of like a kind of irreconcilable antagonism, perhaps, and that socialism therefore needs to become, in his important concept, which he is really influenced by George Orwell here, centered upon common decency.
Your audience won't like that either.
Well, we'll see. I know
Maybe
this
I
is
don't
a
know. I don't know.
very
Actually, I don't know exactly what your audience is like. But if they don't like me critiquing actually existing socialism, Orwell,
no. Look, I mean, I bring on a whole variety of guests, and this is a heterodox. He's a heterodox thinker, but he's also, frankly, trying to face the situation of the rejuvenation of 21st century socialism, and I think anyone that's trying to do that needs to be critically engaged. Anyone that's doing that in a robust, interesting, compelling, controversial way is worth engaging, etc. Okay, so what is common decency? Think about it, Tony. It's almost like, can liberalism truly integrate the common decency of the people? Why must there be, and this is sort of a question to you, why is there this chasm? Why is there this chasm? And I think that we have like empirical and as well as anecdotal proof in our own time that liberalism in fact reproduces this conflict, right? So first off, what do you think of that argument? It's both a historical argument but also very much like applicable to our present. You could apply thought, the notion of virtue hoarders, for example, is very resonant here in a certain way, that it becomes actually a problem of political virtue and the incapacity for liberalism to incorporate virtues from below. And so there's also this question of the international cosmopolitan liberal subject, right? That's not permitted to actually express their interior antagonisms, which are not interior, actually. They're born from material social struggle. So it's also a beautiful Marxist point, because what he's also saying is that liberalism is an ideology that rejects social antagonism born from like things like economic exploitation and, general social suffering. What's your take on all of that?
So part of why I think it's important to critique liberalism in the way that Michéa does is because there are critiques of liberalism that I think actually focus on some of the wrong things and lead into strange places. So there's people who often critique liberal what they think is liberal democracy, even though, what is liberal democracy is something that is really just representative government that predates liberalism, and that it became more democratic due to struggles, really, ultimately. Much of it being the socialist struggle, much of it being the workers' movement, which is why Marx thought that it was a working class who would win the battle for democracy. And he was talking about representative government, right? When he said there was a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, he's writing with England still having property restrictions, right? And he's not thinking you're going to abolish representation. It's why you see in the Civil War in France, his idea of what the dictatorship of the proletariat is really just a much more radicalized version of representative democracy with less aristocratic checks on the most democratic components of it, being the legislature. Now, why critique social liberalism, which is really what Michéa is more critiquing, is because I think this is the core reason in why most people, if you ask most people the difference between a liberal and a leftist, they'll usually think a leftist is just a more radical liberal. Most people can't tell the difference. They often refer to leftists as liberals. And then the leftists love to say, no, that's liberals. We're the left. They love to distance themselves. But why? Is it that everyone's just miseducated? Or is there a real reason why many people can't tell the difference between a leftist and a liberal? Maybe because that is what a leftist is today. Maybe for the average leftist today, at least the ones who have the voices, given the platforms to talk on the university campuses, write the publications, speak on media platforms, often are really just radical liberals.
Yeah, the vanguard of liberalism, maybe. And now here's an interesting point. If we take this idea of morals and virtues, right? What I like about Michéa is he's saying actually this is a part of liberalism, but the morals and virtues of liberalism is evolving. But it's like a class project, and the the petri dish of like permissible morals and virtues of liberalism is exclusive on a class basis. So radical liberals immediately have to face that fact that actually they're, and that's, I think, the Marxist point that's so strong and powerful in what he's saying, right? So like if you're a radical liberal, geez, well, see but this goes back to the conservative thing, because then wouldn't it be fair to say that Marxism should be usurping the meaning of the left, and actually if they are radical liberals, then why would we call them on the left? I mean, maybe they're still on the left, quote unquote, but it comes down to this question of like the terms and what we're willing to fight for. So I don't want to jump ahead to the debate on conservatism as a term, but maybe let's just stick to this. And I sort of cut you off, so you can continue as well.
Well, it's actually why I tend to prefer the word progressivism when describing what he's critiquing. He uses liberalism.
Yes.
And it's because there's actually a lot of liberals who, I mean, what are conservatives today are usually conservative liberals. They agree with much of the basic premises of liberalism, but reject progressivism. But they're super linked. So like, how do you tackle this? We got to get at some point into his critique of historical materialism, Michéa, because you can't avoid that, because that is where he actually thinks Marxism is actually complicit in some of the same fallacies as liberalism, and I think that's a critique that people have made before, and less so common with leftists, but it's a poignant one. With why this term conservative, I mean, to the listeners, if your alarm bells are going off hearing the word conservative, Michéa is very careful to distinguish like conservative from reactionary. By conservative, he doesn't mean hatred of gay people or hatred of immigrants, because this seems a little ridiculous, because a lot of conservatives are like, what do you mean? That's not what we thought. The thing is, a lot of leftists are engineered to think that conservatives walk around with this crazy hatred all the time. A lot of conservatism is just a preference for tradition as opposed to progress. So for a lot of people, having new things that are seemingly feel imposed on them or are new feel a little bit uh, they don't feel they feel skeptical towards them and will take a preference towards what has been tried and true for them. Now, this isn't always bad advice. I mean, G.K. Chesterton summed up conservatism in one sentence, which is, if you don't know why the fence is there, don't tear down the fence before asking why it's there. I would also extend it by saying, like, before you figure out what's going to replace it, it is actually generally good advice to not just tear down fences. The thing about progressivism, it really is a march towards tearing down fences. Now, we should scale back to Marx, and this is something Michéa talks about in a different article in that same collection. Marx has a very big critique of progressivism, and he sees capitalism itself as the most progressive force we've ever seen. I mean, all that solid melts into air. It's the biggest single-handedly the most powerful force in destroying traditions. Think about it. I mean, you have uneven development. You have to move into areas to find jobs. This is literally like how people leave behind traditions. This is how you have mass migration start as a phenomenon. Now,
Right. That's the
progressivism.
whole meaning of the proletariat. Enclosures. Yeah.
Oh, and you also get all these weird side effects psychologically, right? Where they can get really complicated. Sometimes they happen so fast, these social changes as a result of the economic changes, that we're very slow to keep up with what's even happening until much later down the line.
Right.
For Michéa, liberalism, I would use the word progressivism, but liberalism and the leftists who espouse this liberal worldview quickly become useful soldiers in providing the superstructure for this change by rationalizing it, by affirming it. Because this is what's a little odd. I identify as being on the left insofar as the classical distinction of left being a preference towards more equality as opposed to more hierarchy. But it's often taken on a meaning also of a preference for change as opposed to conservation or reaction. Now, when it comes to change, why is change itself good? Not all change is good. And itself, capitalism, which is where people are more pro equality, tend to be very critical of. Why would one uncritically affirm all progress? Now, that is kind of what leftism is. And you end up, because also of this simultaneous relativism where you can't assert a good, you end up with all kind of contradictions that are just very transparent all over the left and liberals, which, if you've watched any right-wing media, they love to pick at every single contradiction. It's very easy for them. They can pick out someone who says, oh, there's no issues with, we should have no restrictions on Islamic immigration in France, yet also we should be okay with giving we should be giving gender affirming medication to minors. And, meanwhile, people who are Muslims tend to be critical of, the very concept of being trans, even homosexuality. But how do you square those kind of contradictions? You see in leftist unwillingness to condemn some things. So, for example, so I'm half Lebanese, for full disclosure, and I just knowing about the the Arab world, really, the Middle East. Most people aren't like, especially where I'm from, the Levant, aren't ultra conservatives in like a Wahhabist sense. What I find interesting is that whenever discussion about like the burqa or the niqab comes up, leftists always feel the need to like reject any critique of it as racist, or to say, oh, well, that's just them. Let people do what they do. Whereas I would say, no, I think it is oppressive to women to make people wear the niqab. It just is unambiguously
Right.
oppressive.
Yeah.
Now,
So
and,
let me
most
let me
Muslims don't do that anyway. But like the fact that
yeah.
leftists feel even like, oh, I don't know if I should condemn that. It's because they've internalized a liberal worldview where it's everyone has their own views. Everyone can believe whatever they want. and it's their relative view. It's true for them. But the thing is, as Rick Roderick, one of my favorite public speakers, rest in peace, said, this idea that every view is as good as any other, this is what relativism kind of premises on. But really deep down, nobody really believes that. When we actually think about things, we have things that we think are right and that are wrong. Yet we have to act like whatever people believe in their private lives, it's for them. As long as it's not imposing on other people, then it's fine. And that's how you have a left and liberals who are unable to really, handle some of the biggest contradictions that are happening in society.
Yeah, it's almost as if one could read this critique also as a kind of explanation for some of the ways that the left construes of the general political subjectivity, right? So one of the things I want to talk about in our conversation is a very prescient current set of challenges, events, etc., that have really emerged since the leak of the Young Republican in the US, the Young Republican leak on Politico of these WhatsApp private, so-called semi-private chats where young Republican, I guess Zoomers, some millennials, but mostly Zoomers, are praising Hitler, and it's very unclear to what extent they're being ironic or not. And then we have the example of the politician in Maine who's very complex figure. It was also leaked. So it's this theory of this motif of the interior now having this exterior. So there's no escaping, because of the internet, basically. There's no escaping I think everybody should just comport themselves online in this way. And I think most of us do. But what I find interesting is that there is an assumption on behalf of the left that perhaps there's a kind of normalization of very extreme views, or that maybe in general the common people are secret Nazis, or there is a kind of suppressed conservatism of the people, and so on. And I feel as if Michéa's response to that would be that part of that is driven by a kind of mistrust, that liberalism creates a mistrust in the common sentiments, the common worldviews, the common traditions of the masses, and that this develops what he calls, I think in a nice way, a violence that is built into liberalism because liberalism requires the eradication of all forms of discrimination in entirety. So what you're dealing with is the necessity for the construction of a political body which is devoid of social antagonisms, and B, reflective of a pure pacification in their interior of any prejudicial, discriminatory thought. And the Orwell thing becomes very essential here in terms of 1984. So you see what he's giving us is a comprehensive theory about how liberalism becomes totalitarian. It's very compelling. And I think that he's right. And it's very powerful. I don't know what to say. It's like once you sort of see that, because he's giving you a logic. He's almost giving you like a full theory to understand how the connection between the left and liberalism produces. Like it's almost like a natural outcome. Does that make sense? And can you kind of add to what I just said?
I would like you to, though, elaborate what Michéa means and what Orwell means, because that's where he borrows the idea of common decency, just because I can anticipate people in the comment sections finding that suspect, because, there's a long tradition of leftists, even Marxists, especially Marxists, actually, even some of the good ones, who are very suspect of the very idea of common sense. So, what is this common decency that Orwell and Michéa speak of, that the left is the left looks down upon or overlooks completely?
Yeah, I guess I would define it as I don't know if we could call it kind of like the organic basis by which the working class comports their um, condition in the world on the one hand. So it's kind of like the natural set of affects, values that are born from the proletarian condition in a certain way. And that those affects, values, sort of modes of being in the world, it's not that they have a homogeneity, but it's that left to their own devices, it's kind of like a very liberty-based argument. So like the liberty aspect of liberalism is something that he very much thinks needs to be preserved. It's not that he's a libertarian socialist, because he actually has huge polemics with them. I think he would reject that title. And I think that we should reject that title, because that title is uncritical to economic liberalism, right? So he wants to be critical to both economic and cultural liberalism. And again, it's that unity of the two that gets disavowed and that gets entangled. That's a problem. But socialism as common decency would be about the creation of a society in which common decency can be integrated and can be made to flourish. And it sort of is based upon a logic of an organic trust in the masses' own capacity to regenerate their own conception of shared living. And so it's sort of a embrace of an autonomy for the liberty of proletarians to basically I don't want to say like kind of have a separate culture or a subculture. It's not a subculture argument.
Or their cultures,
Cultures, plural. Oh, sure, sure.
their
But the point
traditions.
yeah, the point that I think he gives us is that it's the site of a kind of a profound social conflict that liberalism simply cannot resolve. And socialism is the only means by which we can resolve it. That's what I would say, but perhaps you might add to that.
In practical terms, I can think of a way to describe common decency and what they mean by that. So, what do most people commonly believe? What is more the rule as opposed to the exception? There are some things that are more common, among people in terms of attitudes that are actually very scrutinized by people on the radical end of liberalism and the left. You see this with the left's, since the turn of the 60s, really, and especially the deconstructionist turn, which Michéa is very critical of, an obsession with challenging homogeneity and a almost fetishization for heterogeneity, for difference, for the exception. Now, acceptance of the exception is a different argument from making the exception the true thing or the rule. And this is where you get the paradox of acceptance and tolerance. I think you can get a lot of people to tolerate different practices, different views, different sexual orientations. But when you try to tell them that their view of man and woman or whatever of gender is wrong, and that actually we're going to teach your kids this alternative progressive way of learning about this, you will get a reaction because you're going against the common sense of the majority. Now, even if we're totally convinced the common majority is wrong, if one espouses to be a socialist, they usually have the interests, ostensibly, of the majority of people in mind, even if it's from a Marxist or non-Marxist socialism. If they're Marxists for the working class is the majority. Really, no matter how broadly you define it in today's societies,
Right. I mean,
most
you could
majority.
make an argument that the early 20th century revolutions in Russia and China were dealing with a class of the peasantry,
Peasantry.
which is a totally, often in some cases technically the majority, but compared to the industrial
Well,
proletariat,
they were the majority, and
they
that's why
were.
Mao succeeded, because he respected the peasantry, actually, until he later didn't. But well, like during the Long March, I mean, was one of the most successful, really one of the most successful like political heists in history, largely because unlike the Marxists who took a KMT position in overlooking the peasants as backward, as unrevolutionary, as whatever, Mao is like, no one's listening to the peasants. Let's actually listen to the peasants. Maybe actually the fact that they're illiterate, maybe that's a strength because they're not brainwashed to all this bourgeois ideology, So I'm just saying, Mao, will later support the Cultural Revolution, which I talked about,
Yeah.
which meant something different for him than all this kind of cultural subversion that is often remembered about it. Because actually, I think that Cultural Revolution is more of a Western left thing, actually. If you look at what the Western left has become, it's become overly obsessed with cultural revolution. And I think there's a lot of people who are attracted to the left for stuff like economic justice and stuff, who didn't sign up for a whole set of cultural revolutions. And you get this paradox where you get liberal politicians who will actually co-sign parts of the Cultural Revolution, but will not support the economic justice. And that's how you end up with very unpopular governments in the far right, right? I mean, I'm talking about Obama here. I'm talking really about Kamala Harris, this failed run, Justin Trudeau in Canada, people who are extremely progressive socially, or at least pretend that they are, to their leftist base, by the way, who they want to appeal to. That's another thing. Leftists can't escape this distinction, because leftists will say, oh, liberals are, about this progress, but it's fake because they're not really about the economic interests as well. Well, why do you think they signal the progressive stuff? Even though if it's not popular with a lot of people, it's because it's popular with the crowd. It is popular with the crowd. And
Right.
leftists and liberals come from a similar sociological milieu, which is universities. They are aspiring to be part of the professional managerial class. Even if you defend that as a class in the classical Marxist sense, you can at least accept it's a strata, right? I think it's a class. But, it's a strata at the very least. And people who have a college degree, they are expecting a different kind of job. They're not expecting to do manual work in the long run, most of the time anyway, unless they're, getting high paid skilled work. They're usually aiming for something that is not that's intellectual labor. So you get a subject that is fundamentally different from people who do manual labor and just different from people who don't go to college. This distinction is why you have liberals and leftists espouse similar cultural views than a working class conservative. I'll give you an example. So a lot of people think I'm just like critiquing a straw man. There is so many examples I can think of why this is important. Think about it this way. The idea of, and it's relevant to your Graham Planter point, why are some leftists totally hostile to the idea of like a democratic socialist who's in the Democratic Party working with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has no corporate donations, on a legislation that's economic or has to do maybe with defunding Israel perhaps, than they would with working for a liberal. So like leftists will be very hostile to working with working class conservatives, or people who at least are trying to represent the interests of the working class. But and they'll say that's a red-brown alliance because they think anything that's in alliance with right and left, even if it's populist or class-based or not, it's dangerous. But they'll kind of reluctantly accept most of the time the idea of like voting for a Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, even though they are explicitly at odds in terms of class interests, will be given, just as much, if not more, corporate donations. But it's because they share a similar cultural sensibility. What really irks out a lot of leftists is the cultural sensibilities of people who are Republican. Now, I think why to bring to the Graham Planter point, we can get to that. It was a little hard segue, I think.
No, it's good. No, it's
It's a
very
bit of a
related.
hard.
Let me
Yeah.
try to situate this back in this wider theme of the unity of
Mhm.
the cultural social with the economic liberalism, because again, I'm of the view that Michéa gives us something comprehensive to look at the way that of a relation of necessity. whereby liberalism requires that unity. But the problem becomes the way that the left almost becomes a handmaiden to the enforcement of the cultural, as if the cultural wing of liberalism, if it is successful, if it is empowered, which of course we have many examples of the cultural wing of liberalism being very empowered, I would argue that the whole woke period was the triumph of the left within liberalism. And we saw that it was incapable of doing anything regarding the economic.
Perfect
Okay.
example of that is why do so many people on the right say, and most people, a lot of people believe them, that the left runs the media and runs
Right.
academia.
Right.
And for the left is like, well, of course they don't. That's silly. Well, it's like, yeah, they don't. Socialists don't run the media. Socialists don't run academia, but left liberals do, and not everywhere, but a
Right.
lot of institutions. Anyone who's been in them knows that's true. It's totally true.
It
There is
has
a preference for cultural liberalism over conservatism
right.
by far.
All of this has a kind of paternal dynamic of the children enforcing the efficacy, let's say, of the cultural enforcement of liberalism, and the parents doing the economic, the dirty work. And like, we shelter you from that, but we'll let you be stewards of the cultural over here. And that, if you think about that through a class lens, as a kind of upper middle class habitus, it kind of makes sense. And I think many critiques of wokeism that are centered on the class analysis, like I would even reference We Have Never Been Woke by Garby.
Incredible book. I'm having him on the show soon.
Yeah, it's a very important book.
Very good book.
So okay. Now, socialism is in a strange position here, or a difficult position, because it has to reject both foundations that unify liberalism. And that leaves socialists with nothing other than the common people or the working class as their primary, I don't want to say constituent, but like that's your base. And one of the challenges we've seen, of course, is that practically, politically speaking, it's been very difficult for the left. And this, I think, is why after Occupy Wall Street, for example, the left tried to do left-wing populism, which I think was largely failed. But we've struggled to sort of forge the independence to develop a socialism of common decency because liberalism is so hegemonic. And I want your take on that. How? Because again, this kind of also relates back to the conservative point, because one of the downsides of conservatives is you can partner with them on the critique of cultural liberalism and they'll get behind you, but you cannot partner with them on the revolution of the economic foundation of capitalism, because that is the centerpiece of their worldview when push comes to shove. So in a way, it's almost a mirage that you have solidarity with them on the cultural critique of liberalism, because this economic foundation, you will not. And that's why I don't like his use of the word conservative for that reason. But you differ from me. Why?
Yeah. So I, as well as probably, Michéa, I think, are less interested in, building solidarity with conservative pundits and politicians. That's not really the interest there. You can trust politicians as far as you can throw them. It's really people. And if you look at any polling data, a lot of people are conservative by the standards of the most progressive people. Conservative, or at least indifferent or skeptical of a lot of progressive ideas. You can push progressive ideas up to a point. I think there was a breaking point where a lot of people were done with that. I've seen it, very vividly. I mean, look, you mentioned left populism. I think Marxists, who probably make up a lot of the listeners of this show, often get ahead of themselves in talking about the revolution, because I don't even think that is thinkable until you at least give the social democracy a chance to fail. In Europe, you did, yet you still actually don't have a revolutionary left, which tells you something. I mean, like, the thing is usually the revolutionary left and the reformist left they emerge at the same time. It's not like one over the other, because if you're going to have a class politics, there'll be a wing of that is more revolutionary, one that's more reformist, but you need
Yeah,
a working class movement, and that just doesn't exist. So, like,
exactly. Well, what you're articulating
yeah,
you're articulating what we call the neo-Kautskyist position, which I generally support. So that's why I'm not a left communist, and why I think social democracy, strategic partnerships with social democrats, is essential. Just to
right.
clarify my own view on that.
Hmm.
But again, let's go back to the conservative point here,
Sure.
because you said it's the people, it's the common people that are conservative in this natural way, and I think that's true. We
Hmm.
don't disagree about that. But why is it that a lot of these people that can be Harvard educated conservatives and QAnon supporters, they pander to the conservatism of the common people very, very adeptly. And they're doing it against cultural liberalism and its hegemony. So we need to go against the hegemony of cultural liberalism as much as we do economic foundation too. So how do you square that
Right.
chasm? And intellectuals, you said intellectuals, yeah, but to gain resources, and you know this as a political theorist yourself, you need to build institutions and alliances. So how do you
Mhm.
circumvent that fact? Or how do you I mean, does that make sense? Like,
Yes, yes, I see.
because when you
So,
say I'm for conservative, you will not get the partnership unless you do a very great job at making, I don't know, 100 YouTube videos, and you shift the zeitgeist and people can see it now.
mm,
We've come to the light.
right.
How are you gonna make that sell?
So, okay, this is important, and this will be articulated in an article I have coming out on my new Substack called "The Genealogy of Wokeism," and it's about how I define wokeism. And quite simply, this ties in. Wokeism is a conception of politics that is predicated on the awakening of a correct consciousness as being the a priori for political solidarity. So politics becomes about waking people up. It envisions a political movement as people changing minds, and then you have political change. I think this is completely wrong. And it doesn't work. You can't just change everyone's minds. What you can do is get certain groups of people to be on board with certain policies and agendas that they have mutual interests in having. So this is, the constellation of, a working class coalition, or a working class, even petite bourgeois coalition, which I'm actually very open to. I'm even open to parts of the fallen professionals, right? And the parts of the PMC being part of this coalition. I think you need to be really can't afford at this point to be really choosy about, some people are really choosy about who they even pick as working class, like our baristas working class. Like, give me a break. Like, at this point, you want to have a broad coalition that has a basis of power. That's very important. Why did Marx pick the working class? Because they had power to stop production. Marx didn't envision the working class exerting power by changing people's minds. It was by exerting their power to basically stop production and pretty much stop the money making machine, okay, that keeps the rich rich,
Right,
from going when they would like
right.
to, in order to get either demands or in his goal, you know, to eventually push for, communism. Now, I think the communist question, whether you believe in that or not, even that's only possible if you have a working class, or at least a class coalition of some kind, capable of exerting power. What is the left now? Fallen professionals who are desperate to find jobs, and and students who it's not like a powerful coalition. I mean, the left has replaced the working class with the popular front of the vulnerable. It's now become representing marginalized groups, a very broad ideological category that's not
Part
constituted
of the
in the material
reason,
reality.
I think the reasons for that are pretty well known, Let's review a couple of them. We have the legacy of the New Left. We have the historical institutions built in that strategic frame of thinking, which opened the door to the right wing capturing the working class, and that the consequence of that capture, which I think is pretty real. There's like good and bad news with that capture, right? There's good news in the sense that we know that the working class can move out of that alliance, say even with Trumpism, fairly quickly, just as we saw this very dynamic swing voter phenomenon. You go to Obama, then you go to Trump. There's a huge portion of people that just want a change to the status quo, and what by that they mean an economic transformation, really any means necessary. So anyone that has like that is compelling and is angry enough is going to sort of connect with me. So it's like this kind of latent common sense class consciousness. The problem that I have with this, again, going back to the economic thing, is like, where's the educative element that almost would be able to do two things? De-intensify the culture conflagration that liberals recruit the left to participate in. Liberals recruit the left to ignite the culture war, to ignite it. One of the interesting things I'm seeing right now with Ezra Klein after Charlie Kirk is that Ezra Klein is saying we should, as liberals, move away from the radical left, which believes in like no platforming and no debate, because he wrote that New York Times thing where actually we should debate Kirk. And then Taiwo, the elite capture.
Yeah. Was it
He wrote an article saying
Tennessee Wokes?
No, Taiwo, the
for his name. Oh no, this is not
Femi Taiwo, the philosopher at Georgetown who wrote Elite Capture. He wrote a piece in the Boston Review against Ezra Klein, saying we should no platform people like Kirk because people like Kirk are fascist. For which he said Kirk is a fascist akin to, analogously to, Sir Oswald Mosley, who was a British fascist in a literal sense, the British Fascist Party from the 1920s. And he lived until he was like, whatever, I think the 1980s. So putting aside the debate as to whether Kirk is a fascist, I don't think he is. I think he's a Republican opportunist.
You give me a break.
He's not.
And like these people really don't follow the right at all, and they reveal that when they use these.
Well, yeah, there's that problem. But on a deeper point, what I'm wondering about is how you can. Yeah, well, I guess you've kind of answered it. So I guess your answer is building particular class coalitions.
But how to do that? I think
that's still we're not going to solve that on this. We're having a philosophical conversation after all.
I actually think the answer is easier than one might expect.
Meaning?
So the fear that makes some leftists uncomfortable whenever we have this discussion, I can already imagine what the comments are. You want to throw trans people under the bus. Oh, so you don't care about marginalized people? They say the same thing. That like, but look, okay.
What's your response?
It's very simple. Like, I think this is what not to do. First of all, it wouldn't really do that much to simply like become an anti-woke personality full time, like to just like for leftists to just bash woke all day. Like, I don't think that's how you necessarily get back the working class. It's just like you don't need to prioritize these issues. That's the thing. The kind of the issues of trans issues, I think, have always been crazy because they don't even reflect most trans people that I've met. Like, known in that, like, most trans people are just want to be left alone and live a life. Like, that being said, I've never met like trans youth. They're all been adults. I think the youth category is way more contentious. But most people just want to like live with equal rights to other people. It's not this idea, like, you don't need everyone to believe. Like, sure, it would be nice if people didn't look at a trans person in a bigoted way, but is it realistic to make everyone, like, not transphobic? Like, the civil rights movement didn't try to make everyone not racist. Like, it's not like the civil rights movement abolished racism, nor could it.
Right.
But it could give Black people equal rights. And where did it fail? Though it failed in the economic end, right? And that's where you get the mixture of what I would say confused politics, and I think good instincts. I mean, you had the Black Panthers, but then after that collapsed, largely due to, I think, very complicated that whole history. But when I think really the failure of communism was a disaster because it created such a nihilism where what came after it was worse, in that like people gave up on class politics entirely after the failure of communism, and it resulted in people going to all these different directions, like doubling down on race politics that really went into the abyss, or really like what if you think about it this way: if you're a leftist, especially one who is benefited from more access to college, but like there's no class politics, and it's maybe especially up until pretty recently taboo to be into class politics. What are you, some kind of communist? Oh, the working class, that's outdated, right? Socialism, communism, that's outdated. We're beyond that. So what do you pick up as a leftist? You end up making these cultural issues the big thing that you're all about. And it's especially common if the leftists themselves are kind of also remote from practical economic concerns. As many are quick to point out, this is an old conservative critique because it's true, that a lot of Marxists, and you are yourself are not an example of this, you actually have a working class background, but many Marxists are limousine liberals. It's
Well, okay.
true. And
So
that's why you end up with a Marxist who will they say they care about the working class, but at the end of the day, they end up adopting some weird third worldism and like being against anything that could actually lead to political change in their country, which reveals to a lot of other people that they're not serious. If one is a socialist, you care about the majority, especially if one's a democratic socialist, you at least want to respect the views of a majority of people, right?
I think you're hitting on,
It's
yeah.
weird to like dismiss so many people, right? Is like reactionary. What I think is not that the left should, for example, take it like it shouldn't, just merely adopt the right position. I think it should just adopt what is a correct position and what makes sense and what meets the needs of people.
Yeah.
Now, and the thing about like immigration, there is a nuanced take to be had about that, which Michéa talks about, especially in the context of France. To act like that issue, for example, has no class relation, it's solely a racial thing, that's just delusional. Immigration is super baked into the economy. I mean, what do you think? You really think that workers are stupid enough to not realize that importing tons of cheap labor, workers who are exploited by big capitalists, so that the workers who grow up in the country have less leverage, over their bosses? You think that like they're stupid enough to think that that doesn't hurt them?
Yeah.
It's like, no, they're actually like smart and aware of that, because people, generally speaking, they might not be politically woke, but they're usually aware of what is in their life. So like, the common things people respond to is like, is cost of living going up or down? Is it harder to have a family, or is it easier to have a family? Like that's what people think about. And the idea that immigration is completely not tied to it, I would agree that it's not the main thing, but it is tied to it
Right.
in a way that when leftists act like any immigration concern is solely about race. For some people, it is about race, by the way. I'm not denying that. But for not
Yeah.
for everyone, it is. And when leftists say, "Oh, yeah," this brilliant exchange I saw with actually a far right person and a social democrat who was overlooking this was the far right person said something about immigration, and the left wing person responded saying, it's not the immigrant versus the worker. It's the worker versus the capitalist. You're focusing on the wrong thing. And then the person responded, the right wing person, saying, who do you think is wanting to bring all of these immigrants here, dumbass? Very powerful argument. I mean, because that's the thing. That's why Bernie Sanders agreed with Steve Bannon against the, visas.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, oh yeah, we want to just import cheap. So there's a non-racist way to talk about immigration, I think, that is
Yeah.
respectful, not hateful to immigrants
Right.
themselves, but it doesn't take this clueless, rootless, cosmopolitan obliviousness towards immigration, which many leftists do, and
Right.
show their complicity with liberal capitalism in, right? And that's all related to as a bit of a rant, but all related to this theme.
Yeah. So let's reiterate the argument that Michéa helps us. Like, what does he help us think? He helps us think that something like wokeism actually is about the expunging of material sources of antagonism in common experience, but also in ideology. And that's very important because I think that that's the heart of his, like, if you like to use a fancy word, like materialist point of view here. And I think he's right. And I think that if leftists internalize this, that's a powerful critique, self critique that could be made over actually what is actually the end of your participation in a project which has class imperatives tied to it, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, there's this sociological chasm that you not all leftists, but many participate in, which the ruling class, which liberals want to exploit. They want to exploit this chasm, which is a physical chasm, that is of the question regarding, okay, well, is every Marine that fought in Iraq a Nazi secretly? I mean, I have a cousin who fought in Iraq. I have a brother who is in the army, and I have Trump father and like the whole 9 yards, right?
We have a
So
mutual friend in the Navy.
mutual friend in the Navy. So the point I'm trying to say
We
here
never
is
know what we're
that
talking about, right?
the point I'm trying to say here is that a consciousness of anti-imperialism and the understanding of the American war machine and its brutalism and so on is one question. But I think what's happening right now in our current cultural moment, and this kind of dovetails with the leak dimension thing, and I think that there's a sense in which we have a hard time discerning the true status of the common people's degree of quote unquote reaction. Now, my take on this is that the common people's reactionary sentiment, in a throne sense, let's say, is not as bad as many liberals and leftists would presume. Why? Because I think that the excesses of the last period of the left created a dynamic that we should be more honest about, that did say everything is fascist, and that was a problem, and people do resent it, and they have some degree of that being a very valid thing to resent. The problem that I have is that they take that resentment and that's all that they want to do. I'll give you an example. Unheard, the publication Unheard, is a kind of semi-conservative, critical of cultural liberalism publication. And even though they have had all of these new laws that have put the trans question at bay, in some sense, there's new polls that show that young people are not embracing trans thought or ways of life, etc., and near what I don't even have the numbers, but it's startling. But I noticed that this publication still has a kind of repetitive addiction to talking about this issue. That's where the conservative thing can't work for me, because they don't care to focus where I want to focus, which would be on the economic dimension. They want to stay at the cultural. That's the problem.
I
And
will
that's
say
kind of
this.
where they are at. Like that's why they are almost
Mm,
generated by the
right.
liberals.
Mm.
And then but beyond that, they are just hot air. Beyond that, they are just like, what's after? And I don't see anything after. That's why conservative for me. Okay, I understand the Michéa point you're making about this kind of more abstract kind of way of common conservative disposition. But that's not how it is functions at the institutional level,
Right.
ideological level, intellectual level, and that's where the problem comes for me. But
No, I see
okay,
what you mean. They become like anti-woke warriors.
even when they have had a so-called strategic victory. And let me say one thing about the trans point. I mean, I understand the abuse that can happen to groups. I've seen it with Muslims. I've seen it all over the place. I mean, all of this stuff, racism, all of this stuff can be quite pernicious and psychically a hell. You can create a hell for people. I think that the persecution of trans had is a real issue. I agree with you at the same time that the focus of socialism needs to understand that phenomenon itself as internally riven by class dynamics, and then B, formulate policies, or not policies, but ways of conceptualizing modes of solidarity that are not so focused on minoritarian points of interest.
Minoritarian, right?
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think we agree with that.
The left is minoritarian. That's what it is.
It has
And it-
become that. So then, Tony, we're going to have to do a part 2 to this conversation because I have to break
Indeed.
in a moment. But let me ask you this question as a final one, and I definitely want to continue this because there's so much left to unravel with you. How can a conservative socialist vision actually begin to redefine the left? Like, in other words, what happens to the left? Because wouldn't also rather the tactic be to actually get class traitors and of within the left? Because if this general critique we're putting forward is not developing class traitors, if that's the right word, then what is it good for? Because we also need to ask the question, and I think a lot of people are very pragmatist in a false way about this, where they say, oh yeah, Trump killed wokeism. It's not coming back. I actually disagree with that.
Yeah. It's going to be the Marxists who will pick it up. That's my prediction. Not Marxists like you, but like the people who you're talking about who are like, these kind of, I think honestly, you see the expression of third worldism and a lot of frankly, a lot of the decolonial Marxism often ends up being a more sophisticated version of the woke politics, but
See,
usually for the fallen professional
let me say
who has
something
more
about
resentment.
let me say something about this. I think that you are exerting too much cynicism regarding those tendencies. Let me tell you why. Because I've seen many comrades within those tendencies, okay, relate to them for very particular reasons on the one hand. On the other hand, you're sort of presuming that Marxists that are third worldists are only that, and that it narrows their scope of political vision so dramatically that nothing else is possible. And I have seen many third worldists who, you see, that's my position, right? Is I'm more ecumenical because I think people shift on these things. I've told you about my experience with Gerald Horne, where even Horne was exhibiting some shifting. Not everybody is like an opportunist. That's not what I'm
That's what's
saying.
great about talking to people who you disagree with. People do shift when they are forced to talk to people, which is why I would totally disagree with the guy who said you shouldn't talk to Charlie Kirk. I think, Charlie Kirk talking to leftists was more open to talking about leftists than a lot of leftists were open to talking to people like Charlie Kirk. And that says something about a problem. If you can't defend your ideas, that means your foundation is weak. I'm not afraid of talking to any conservative.
I would not talk to fascists I would not talk to Fuentes, because I think when you get to that level, you're entering into criminal and kind of dark Machiavellian dynamics where the foundation of trust is not present. It's not present.
So I think of what is their desired outcome of their politics and how likely is it to win. So where I could at most see a restriction or being against talking to actual fascists who explicitly want to establish a dictatorship in which if they were to assume power and if they had any likelihood whatsoever of gaining that power, I would be silenced, and people who disagree with them in general would be silenced. In fact, this is how I feel about Marxism, Leninism. But the only reason why I do talk to Marxist Leninists, and I'm not against platforming them, is because I think there's no way their vision is going to succeed anywhere. But in general, dictatorial politics is, I think, more important as to whether they're reactionary. like someone like Tucker Carlson, I think is a white supremacist. However, he's explicitly said that liberal democracy should be taught in school as the better form of government compared to fascism or communism or dictatorship. Like he said that in the Sam Altman conversation, and he was like shocked that like he was questioning if like ChatGPT would not give an answer that was clear on that. Now it's like because he's just a racist like liberal at the end of the day. You can coexist with people like that, and that's probably the majority of right-wing people, honestly. If you look at even some of the far right in Europe, like their scales, like in Maloney, she's not out here rounding up communists in Italy, right? And she's not rounding up communists in the gulags like Mussolini was. I think the effects of the politics matter than whether you find them problematic, because then how do you draw the line, right? Like, I'm not afraid of even debating. I'm not afraid of debating even Fuentes. Honestly, I can see that argument against it if you have a big platform, because you might help legitimize him. It really depends on how you conduct the conversation. These things are very slippery. Like, you don't want to be like Dasha and whatever her name is, and the Red Scare podcast, who they just had him on and glazed him the whole time.
Well, hold on a
But
second.
like,
Hold on. The question of legitimizing is an interesting one, because I would actually argue that there's a lot of marginal figures, people who have a following that is sort of up for grabs or that could be persuaded. I'm very much engaged with, in line with going there and entering into the lion's den, as it were. Fuentes' position is not like that. There's no openness or receptivity amongst the gripers, for as far as I can see.
you'd be
But
surprised.
would I?
I think, yeah, their audience is incredibly young, and young people's minds are very malleable.
Yeah, but you see,
It's just I think most people the reason why we're in a position where Nick Fuentes is considered a very smart pundit is because a lot of the people who talk to him are doofuses. Like, I think that's what it is. The bar has been lowered. I mean, if you look at part of the reason why he was able to thrive when talking to Candace Owens is Candace Owens couldn't even articulate the points against his race and IQ politics. She was saying she could only cite like some other person. She said, well, this other conservative said it was wrong. She couldn't just like point out the contradictions with the race and IQ stuff, or do the more powerful thing, which is, where are you going with this?
Right.
Because this is the trick of a lot of right-wing truisms. They bring up things that might have truisms, but when you bring them to scale, it's like, where are you going with this? Like, someone who's anti-Israel versus, talks about the Jews, who's anti-Semitic. I always like to bring up people who are obsessed with, talking about, is the Holocaust exaggerated? And I will say, well, let's accept your presumption that it is a little exaggerated. So what? What's your point here? Where does this go? Where does this lead?
Right.
It's kind of a point I make with Stalinists who like to say, oh, the death counts are exaggerated. It's like, okay, what is your goal though? Is your goal just historical accuracy? Sure. Is your goal to like say that, that regime wasn't that bad, we should try it again?
No, the goal is to.
Some of them it is that, by the way. A lot of them it is that.
It's that, but it's also to stoke a paranoia of a persistent fantasy of a class persecution. Like, it's the Jews, right? It's the Jews that are doing that's really what it leads to. So
It leads to just targeting people. That's usually what it leads to.
Look,
when you single out a group of people, it does lead to that.
Okay, so this is amazing. This is a great start. We're just warming up. We're going to pause. We're going to come back very soon. I'm going to release this to my Patreon, and then we'll release the next episode very shortly after that. Very grateful for Tony and your courageous insights, your challenging insights. We have disagreements here, but you have a sort of. I mean, I think it also is important for you to caveat things that you're saying with a tone of respect and compassion.
Yeah.
Because what is happening with the Trump phenomenon is pretty brutal. And like this idea that the left, like, oh yeah, creates a hysteria, or almost like a schizophrenia, where it's like, oh yeah, well, you have just told us it's all about the marginalized and the vulnerable. So now we just want to pretend there's no such thing as the vulnerable. When of course there is, you know.
Can I say, just like, 'cause I didn't really get to answer your question when you said, how do you envision this conservative left, if there's time, like real quickly?
Very
That's an
quickly,
important point.
very quickly, but please, and then
Okay,
we'll close.
and I'll use this as to relate something you alluded to. You know, you mentioned Oswald Mosley, and I thought immediately, I thought it was very telling that Oswald Mosley actually did incredibly horribly in the elections. You know, he was a massive failure. He was not very popular, despite being a very excellent, amazing speaker. Was not popular. He did not have electoral success. And you know what he blamed? The bloody Labour Party. That if it wasn't for the bloody Labour Party, we'd be winning. Now, why is the far right winning today? And the left is not. Now, what was the Labour Party doing back then that they are now doing? Back then, the Labour Party wasn't telling everyone that they're wrong about all their basic preconceptions. Now, that's what I would say. You don't have to take this position where you're overly obsessed with culture, but at the same time, not to be oblivious to it either. Because the thing about what happens to people who say, let's not talk about culture at all. What happens is that they ignore it, they suppress it, and then it hits, especially if they actually are secretly a little critical, it hits a boiling point where the resentment boils up. And I think what happens to a lot of leftists, how they lose their brain, and this is a classic trope, right? Is because they never talked about it, and it hits a point, and they're like, "Fuck the left! I'm out of here. I'm gonna go talk to Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens. Fuck the left!" Oh, because they just had it, and that's the thing. I think a better way is to almost get it out of the system instead of just wait for it to like climax.
You know, that reminds me of Zizek. It's almost. I'm not saying you're plagiarizing him at all. I'm not saying that. You're saying it in your own way, but it kind of is a fundamental point that he makes. And I know that the problem with him is that his provocative stuff goes so far. But but you have a good balance, Tony, and I very much admire what you're doing, and I'm excited to pick this up again. We'll pause here. To be continued.